I have made a proposal, in fact, a letter of intent to Canfor to purchase not only polar timber, but also to acquire the Fort St. John operations and their timber rights, as well as the Plateau Vanderhoof operations of Canfor and their timber rights, as well as the timber rights in Houston associated to the Houston sawmill. Hello, everybody. My name is John Brink, and I'm the CEO of the Brink group of companies in Prince George, British Columbia. And for all those people watching us from around the world via podcasting, this is our podcast number 310 in our series. In particular, the podcast that we are doing now is on the BC forest industry in crisis. And the last ones that we did, and I did on this issue, is podcast number 266. And there are a number of other podcasts that I have done with experts as well in that same series. The reason that I did the podcast and started the podcast BC Forest Industry in Crisis is because in the 60 years that I've been in British Columbia and in the forest industry, and 50 years that I've been owning a forest company in northern British Columbia and Prince George and other locations, I have never seen a more difficult time in the industry than we are encountering today. The last time that I did the podcast, 266, BC Forest Industry in Crisis, I ended that podcast with the frustration of that there are major issues. Capital is leaving the province. Companies that have been here for 70 years and longer, that employ a lot of people, have decided to exit the province because they can no longer be competitive in the environment that surrounds us here in British Columbia. We are become from the lowest cost producers of fiber, of lumber actually, globally, to the highest cost producers. So a lot of, in particular, public companies that have to answer to their shareholders in the ownerships of those companies have decided that they will no longer invest in the companies until things are changed politically, both federally and provincially, and progressively have decided to leave. And there are some good examples of announcements recently, with Canfor announcing further shuts and for all intents and purposes exiting British Columbia. But it's not limited to Canfor. West Fraser and other companies have decided to do the same. What are the underlying issues? It is not being competitive in the industry is the one, and then strategically from a government perspective, both federally, but the focus is on BC. But one of the issues is softwood lumber duties for the main market being the United States. Duties are negotiated on a federal level, although BC, being the largest producer of lumber, is very involved in this, or should be very involved in it. And federally, it appears like we have not done enough to negotiate a strong agreement with the American industry. So we have, although duties, softwood lumber duties, have been part of the reality virtually for 100 years, but more particular since 1982. Where we are now is in a situation where the duty rate on lumber being manufactured and exported to the United States pay a duty rate of in excess for some companies, Canfor, West Fraser, Chalco, for in excess of 16-17%. For all the others, we are paying duty rates of 14.5%. As of the coming January 1st, those duty rates for Canfor and likely best phrase and some of the others, particularly Canfor that I'm familiar with because we're a strategic partner of them in terms of interaction on fiber. Their rate may go as high as 35% and maybe even higher starting January the 1st. That in addition to other changes that have taken place. The annual allowable cut in the province of British Columbia normally is in the area of 60 million cubic meters annually, so between 60 and 70. Now the annual allowable cut is somewhere around 50 million cubic meters. However, because of changes that have taken place on the land base, it is probably less than 30 million cubic meters and maybe closer to 20 to 25 million cubic meters. Hence, but has happened further announcements of shuts and closures because it appears that the governments federally and provincially are not able to deal with the issues, and so capital has decided not to invest, but not only not to invest, but to exit the province. This is extremely serious. It will affect us all. We will no longer attract entrepreneurship, and certainly entrepreneurship stimulates investment for capital. At one point, we used to employ 180,000 people in the forest industry. Now it's probably less than half of that. The value-added manufacturing, which we do, used to have, I was the founding president of the BC Council Value-Added Wood Processors in 2000. We used to have 800 companies doing value-added manufacturing, that is, putting more value, social and economic, into the resource. We had 8 associations, 800 companies. Less than 25% of them are remaining due to policies, mainly provincial, but also federally, and again, softwood lumber. At one point, what would happen is that secondary manufacturers would pay on input of the fiber. Give me an example. If input fiber would cost $100 and they added value, social and economic, to make furniture, make whatever products, mass timber of some sort or another, and they would sell it at $1,000, they would have to pay the duties initially at the $100 input value because most of them had no timber. And the allegation is that our timber is subsidized by the Americans. Then now they have to pay duty on the finished value, and that leaves no value, no viability for secondary manufacturers. Most of them already started to disappear in early 2000, and the other part that didn't help much was federal provincial policy by the BC Liberal government of the time that made dramatic changes to forest policy in BC. The one was appurtency, manufacturing timber in the area of where it was harvested. And so more and more of the sawmills were concentrating in certain areas rather than manufacturing in the cities or in the regions where the timber was grown. At the same time, the raw material that was relied upon by value-added manufacturers was also, there was an incentive at one point for value-added manufacturing where 20% of the AAC was designated to value-added manufacturers. They called it the Small Business Program. Section 16.1 was eliminated in 2002, 2003 by the then government. The other part troubling to value-added manufacturing was that in 2005 in particular, most of the lower quality lumber was exported to China. And that continued virtually up to recently, further creating extreme difficulty to value-added manufacturing, and as a result, a lot of those companies disappeared. That being said then, where do we go from here? And I believe that, as I said in my opening, this is the most difficult time that I have seen in the 60 years that I have been here. I'm an optimist, always have been, and I still believe that there is opportunity. And I don't, and my companies do not intend to exit British Columbia or the forest industry. I see still opportunity. In order to share that with you and explain it to you, I have to take you back to what stimulates, what makes me work, why don't I feel so strongly about the industry and so strongly about British Columbia? Let me take you back. I was born in 1940 in northeastern Holland at the beginning of the World War, the Second World War, when Hitler decided the dictatorships to take over Europe. It was a tough time, and we went through all the ups and downs relating to war, and still affects me from PTSD, obviously, and since that time. On April the 12th, 1945, we were liberated by the Canadians, by the Canadian Army, and it made such an impression on me that I always knew that as I grew up from being then about 4.5, 5 years old, I would go to the land of my heroes, Canada. I was going to go first when I was 17, but my parents wouldn't let me in. I was drafted into the Dutch Air Force for 2 years, and then I finally decided to leave when I was 23. I wanted to start from the bottom, and I had the dream. My grandfather was a master carpenter. My dad worked in lumber, and I loved the industry. I was not overly successful academically. I left school at 13, and I worked in a furniture factory, and then in the evenings went to college to become a furniture maker. So lumber was in my blood. Then I worked for a period of time for the largest importer in Western Europe, a company by the name of William Pond. Now let me tell you, the culture there was that in my dad's company, or he was managing for this company, that I would not dare, or anybody would not dare to step on a piece of lumber. We respected it. That always still stayed with me. And so when I came to Canada, I knew I wanted to go to British Columbia because that's where all the trees are, but I wanted to start from nothing. I had a suitcase, 3 books, 2 sets of clothes, and very little money when I left Amsterdam. I flew into Montreal, took the train across Canada, and then landed in Vancouver, went to the immigration office, and I spoke no English. I didn't know anybody, and I didn't have a job. Fortunately, there was a German fellow there. I told him what I wanted to do. I wanted to build a lumber mill in British Columbia. That's what I wanted to do. So he said to me, go to Prince George, 1965, July. Prince George was a boom town. Major investments in the forest industry, pulp mills, sawmills, plywood plants, you name it, it was all here. I arrived here in July of 1965 with 1 suitcase, 3 books, 2 sets of clothes, and I counted my money at least 3 times. I had $25.47, but I had a dream. I would build my own lumber mill. I started out as a cleanup man, then became a lumber pilot, and within a year and a half, I already was a superintendent of one of the larger mills here in the Prince George region. Even that didn't go quick enough for me, but because my dream was to have a lumber mill. So there was an opportunity for me to become manager of a smaller sawmill. And the conditions were that if I would manage that mill for 5 years, I would get 1/3 ownership. I took on the challenge. Okay, John, where was the mill? It was in Watson Lake, Yukon. Watson Lake Lumber. I was there for 5 years and managed Watson Lake Lumber. I had the reputation I was the only one that managed Watson Lake Lumber that did not go under. Unfortunately, My partners there, or the people that owned the mill, had not the same ideas as I had about growth, and I decided to leave, go back to Prince George, start all over again, and started a company in 1975, Brink Forest Products, with $25,000 from the Royal Bank, 3 employees, and myself. Now the challenge was at that time is that virtually all the timber that was available was already taken. So I had to find a niche of some sort that was unique. And I had experience in Holland and had exposure to finger jointing and remanufacturing. So I started on a building experimenting with finger jointing and remanufacturing low-grade lumber. Finger jointing is where you take shorter pieces of lumber, glue them together, and everybody said then at the time, it cannot be done. I believed it could be, and today I've proven that it can be. It is more valuable than solid wood, in fact, in the marketplace. Remanufacturing of lumber was also successful, and I did that for quite a number of years. But it became delicate because at the end of the day, if you want to be successful in the lumber industry, you have to have access to fiber or reasonable expectation of access to fiber. That was difficult for us all along the way. So for the 50 years, virtually 50 years that I've been in business with Brink Forest Products, it has been a challenge. And so the first thing that happened then, I started the finger joint plant, 1975, and then in 1983 there was an opportunity to, because of spruce beetle kill in east of Prince George in the Bowen region, that a lot of the timber that was not taken by industry because it was considered to be low quality, I decided to put up a sawmill in the Bowen region. I did that in 1983 for about 4 or 5 years. We then took the timber from there, cut it into dimensional lumber, sent it into a value-added plant, and then upgraded it quite successfully, finger jointing and upgrading it and remanufacturing. That lasted till about 87. Then we had to move. There was not enough timber there. I then created another mill in Fort St. James, doing basically the same in Fort St. James. And again, there was only so much timber available for us, and then not enough was being made available. So we acquired another operation, finger joint operation, and reman operation in Houston, BC in 2001. Pleasant Valley Remanufacturing in Houston. That company is still operational today. And then from there on in, we further knew that we had to find more security in terms of access to fiber. We lobbied government in regards to 2 issues in particular, and formed then the BC Council Value-Added Wood Processors, and that grew into one of the largest organizations in the province of access to timber, because at the end of the day, timber was the currency. And so the government of the day then made available what they called the small business program, where they would took 20% of the annual allowable cut, designated it to stimulating value-added manufacturing. Was very, very successful in the 90s, created hundreds and thousands of jobs in value-added manufacturing. But unfortunately, then again, due to government policy, in particular then the government of the day decided, and the Liberal government of the day, then BC Liberal government of the day in the province of British Columbia, decided in a new forest policy in 2002 that they would make changes to forest policy that were dramatic in many ways. One of them was appurtency, the obligation to manufacture in the region where the timber is cut. And the second one is to remove a substantial portion of the 16-month program or the designation of timber to secondary manufacturers. That was a difficult policy that adversely affected secondary manufacturing in the province and affected us in northern BC. 2005, a particular difficult period, again for us, with the changes to small business program, stimulating value-added manufacturing. That was obviously no longer there, and value-added manufacturing was in decline, unfortunately, because I believe that's where the future was, and so unfortunately we were not able to make the argument to government, and so we looked for other opportunities for a couple of reasons. The one was that not only had they changed value-added manufacturing and access to fiber, or reasonable expectation of access to fiber in BC, government had decided that together with the Council of Forest Industry and the BC Lumber Trade Council, that it would be in the interest of the companies here and BC in particular, that because of softwood lumber duties and other reasons that they should be exporting more of the lumber manufactured to China. So for Brink at that point, we had a remanufacturing plant that employed probably 130, 140 people. We had been remanufacturing low-grade lumber. That is, what is low-grade lumber? That is dimension lumber of the highest grades. Then that is utility, or number 3, and then economy, which represents anywhere between 6 and 8, 9% of the volume that we had relied on for upgrading and finger jointing. They decided to send more or all of the low grade, and virtually that's what happened for the next 2005 forward. For the next 10, 15 years, all of the low grade lumber was shipped into China. It was not high grade. A lot of people believed, oh, this is good, we'll send all the lumber or more of the lumber to China. What they sent to China was the low grades on which secondary manufacturing relied to sustain their operations and grow their operations. That all disappeared. And not only was it sent to China, it was sent to China in a lot of cases. I'm not being critical, but that's the fact, at a lower cost than remanufacturers likely would be paying inside of British Columbia. That fact then forced us into the position where we had to look at other locations. Brink then looked in Alberta and made a deal in 2005 to purchase Palliser Lumber, the largest lumber remanufacturing in Alberta. Okay, what happened then? Well, unfortunately, in 2005, we purchased the operation. In 2006, the economic down cycle happened, and we were going into one of the deepest recessions that I thought we had ever seen in British Columbia. But it was, worst was to follow, but that was then the worst. And so I had an offer to purchase Palliser from me after less than a year, and I sold the company. From there and then, it was survival. Now I had five times in the years that I started Brink Forest Products, since 1975, where we were virtually down, hanging on by our fingernails, had to start from the bottom over again, reinvent my company. And for our employees. So that's what happened then. And then obviously where we went from there is we survived it. We sold that company, survived it, focused on finger joint manufacturing, doubled the size of our company, tripled the size really of our company, including had then acquired in the Vanderhoof specialty wood in 2016, and so we were building and surviving. But we had to build more of a foundation under those companies, and still looking for opportunities to purchase primary manufacturing and to have more control of our fiber. The next part, obviously, which we are all familiar with, is that the John Oregon government of the NDP announced the intentions paper in June of 2021. And a deal dealt in particular with a number of issues that come to mind. The one was, as was indicated by then the Premier of the province, and I have a great deal of respect for him, where he said there must be more involvement of First Nations. I agree with that. Most of the industry agrees with that. There has to be more care and consideration in regards to old growth, preserving old growth. Most people, and even in the industry, agree with that. And then the third one was to stimulate value-added manufacturing in the province. I agree with that. The announcement was spoken to by Labor, First Nations, and industry. The only one, unfortunately, of industry that wanted to speak to it or was asked to speak to it is myself. And I said simply this, that I believe the future of the industry, forest industry, is where primary manufacturing will change. More of the manufacturing of the sawmills will take place in the regions where the timber grows. The mills will be smaller in size. There will be more technology involved, and subsequently less employment. So what I suggested is, in my presentation, is innovative primary would look like that in order to be competitive, in combination with intensive secondary. And I believed from that presentation that I then made is that of 50% of the lumber manufactured by the primary sector will go up the value chain. 25% of the high grades and 25% of the lower grades will go up the value chain, where we have primary manufacturers working strategically with value-added manufacturers. Either they do value-added manufacturing themselves, or strategic relationships, or where secondary manufacturers own or develop primary manufacturing to secure access to fiber. The key is that we cannot, my argument was, attract value-added manufacturers unless there is reasonable expectation of access to fiber. And that is not to say handouts or subsidies. It says reasonable expectation. Unfortunately, my friends at Kofi disagreed with me, although I had been one of the longest serving members of the Council of Forest Industry for more than 40 years. I was the vice chair, and I left me no choice other than to resign from Kofi in April of 2023 because of strategic differences, in particular as to what will the industry look like as we go forward. This all being said, I have a great deal of respect for the primary sector. I understand the difficulty that they are going to, especially the larger companies, that the changes that have taken place are difficult. Looking then at the intentions paper, is one, is that First Nations should be more involved, and then obviously the access of the land base has never been, in a lot of cases, surrendered, and so therefore they have they have to make decisions in regards to not being consulted only, but also make decisions and have to give consent as to what happens to the land base. I understand that. And then the other part is that old growth, preserving old growth. I visualize old growth as the larger trees, but it went too far. It went too far in regards to smaller stems that are maybe in the interior 150 years old are considered to be old growth. It went too far, where it becomes increasingly difficult for sawmills that have to plan ahead in terms of harvesting. It becomes too difficult to manage. In regards to value added, obviously, the government did not support the value-added sector and made available, not only did they made available to them a program in which they were giving them access to fiber, they took away, they used to be from the 20%, was reduced to less than 1% of the annual allowable cut of the initial 60 million cubic meters. And so where there still was 1.2 million, designated to Cat 2, meaning value added, they reduced it by half to 600,000. How much is that, John? Well, that doesn't even support one sawmill in the province of British Columbia for value added manufacturing. So it was nothing. I want to go back to First Nations. I believe for First Nations, I agree with all the things. I have been supportive of First Nations all along. In the mill that I was managing in Watson Lake in the Yukon for 5 years, we had one white guy that was my sawyer. The rest of them were all First Nations, and I had a good relationship with them. And Prince George, it has always, in our operations in Vanderhoof and Houston, it always has been our policy, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. 1/3 female, 1/3 male, 1/3 minorities, and that has always been our policy. And so I support that, but I also know that there are 206 nations or bands in the province of British Columbia that have to make decisions in regards to the land base. I also know that we have the government of British Columbia, that is then 207 governments that have to decide as to give comfort to the investor and to capital that they can plan ahead. That's one of the major problems right now, is that cutting permits are virtually impossible to get. Everybody's afraid to make decisions, and subsequently, all of a sudden, where we have 50 million cubic meters available, it's less than half of that today. And so a lot of the companies have decided to curtail and to leave. That brings me to today. As we all know, other announcements have been made, in particular by Canfor. They made the announcements in Houston, where they had a big mill, that they had planned to build another mill, spend $200 million. They also they curtailed their operations in Bear Lake, that they have decided to not only curtail, but permanently close the ones in Bear Lake, the major sawmill, and also not go forward with building another sawmill in Houston. That was the one. So that was recently, and then, as Brink already has said, Brink has said ongoing relationships with First Nations, has communications with First Nations about investment and where do we go from here, what can we do together, and also with labor. Brink has always had good relationship with labor, and they have had good relationship with communities. Where do we go from here is the question. And so Brink already announced on some of his podcasts that we had an intent to indicate to Canfor that we are interested in purchasing Pola sawmill. And the reason that we do is to complement not only our current operations, but to expand our operations to further manufacturing, including mass timber, and in fact already have bought equipment for another finger joint plant here and further expanding our operations in Vanderhoof as well as in Houston. The announcements of last week were, and with all due respect to Canfor, we have still a very good relationship. I have a great deal of respect for the Patterson Group and Jimmy Patterson in particular. I respect them deeply, and for Don Kane, the CEO of Canfor. But the last announcement that was made last Wednesday, where 2 more sawmills of Canfor will be shut down permanently, the one in Fort St. John and the one in Vanderhoof, puts us in a position that, and I believe there may be others, that we can no longer protect our company and go looking forward in the future and growing and changing, that we will have sufficient fiber available to our operation. And my responsibility, first and foremost, I'm the sole owner of all my companies, but I have to protect the interest of my employees. And after that announcement, 7 days a week, I get calls on my phone, people in tears saying, what is going to happen to our jobs? I need to provide them with comfort. For me to say, I don't know, is not an answer for me. So we do what we always have done, is that if I see this, that it may adversely affect us, then I have to do something about that. We have started discussions with Canfor in regards to Polar, and we have shown interest of acquiring the Polar sawmill and the tenure associated with it. And so we have indicated that. We have talked to First Nations already for numerous of years and months in different areas about this, and labor. Our plan has to change now because all of a sudden Polar may supply us with fiber for our operations in Prince George, but our operations in Vanderhoof in Houston are still at risk. So I have made a proposal, in fact, a letter of intent to Canfor to purchase not only Polar timber, but also to acquire the Fort St. John operations and their timber rights, as well as the Plateau Vanderhoof operations of Canfor and their timber rights, as well as the timber rights in Houston associated to the Houston sawmill that has been shut down already for a period of time and is an old mill, and we have proposed that we will build a new sawmill in Houston if we were able to convince Canfor and First Nations and the government that this is the right direction to go. What this would do, in fact, is that it would protect not only our value-added manufacturing, but it gives us the opportunity to expand. In Prince George, we would add additional finger joint capacity. We're employing now 400 people, and we would add at least another 150. We would start up again our remanufacturing facility that has been shut down since 2005, start operating that again, and then acquire those mills. Canfor is phasing out and terminating all their employees effective, as I understand it from their press releases, on December 31st. They will no longer be involved and have totally discontinued operating in those operations effective towards Christmas this year. So our proposal is to acquire those operations, the one at Fort St. John, Bear Lake and Plateau, as well as December in Houston, effective April 1st, 2025. Work with First Nations, work with labor and communities to make this come about. We are committed, and we will make this work and turn a bad news story into what I believe a success story, where everybody is working together and again getting to the point where we will eventually or intend to create direct and indirect at least close to 5,000 jobs and 1,500 jobs direct, and preserving jobs that already exist. So turning adversity into the potential for success. We have indicated this in a letter of intent to the CAN4 organization, and we will hope that they will take very close consideration of this with the support from labor, First Nations, and communities and the government. My frustration has been, and I'm not political, but I have indicated our intent, or tried to indicate it to the BC government. Unfortunately, the Minister of Forest, I've contacted him numerous times, have not decided to return my phone calls. Neither has the Premier. And I'm sure he's being very, very busy. I know we got an election October the 19th, but I believe this is of critical importance. It is an opportunity to not only restart those operations, but go beyond that. So where we will get to the point where we will have primary manufacturing with the objective to take 50% of the lumber manufactured, 25% of the high grades, 25% of the low grades, and push it up the value chain. I believe that we grow the best fiber in the world in this province. We can do better. Working with First Nations, working with labor, is that we have to extract more social and economic value from our resources. We also must give comfort to entrepreneurship and capital, that BC still is a very good province and has a good future, and be working with them. At the same time, we have to ask government, both provincial and federal, you must be more proactive and more aggressive in terms of dealing with the Americans, in terms of the potential of pushing up even their duty rates even higher. We're not doing enough of that, and we're not doing enough in British Columbia, nor are we doing enough federally. We must have the people involved in saying, no, this is possible. And the commitment that I will make on behalf of my companies and myself, that I will not exit BC. I believe in British Columbia. I believe in the potential of the forest industry. I have made the proposal. I need the support of communities. I'm in already discussions with both First Nations and labor that this is the right direction to go, and I am 150% committed to make this happen. So that is my podcast that deals, at least with my view, on the potential of the industry. And the fiber is still here. We need to take care of our fiber, more intensive forestry as we go further, more involvement of First Nations, more involvement of communities and in the BC government. Whoever may be elected, who it may be, I believe this proposal has huge potential, but it also gives confidence to other capital investors and entrepreneurs that, yeah, there is opportunity, and maybe it will look different than it did in the past, but this is the future. Thank you.